A downed crew waits beyond the collapsed outer checkpoint at 0740 hours, pinned between drifting smoke and the last usable light. Dust blows across the lane in steady sheets, cutting visibility under 100 yards. The perimeter security officer on scene, an Air Force captain, braces gloved hands against a Jersey barrier as she studies blast marks that contradict the official report. Command insists the breach is contained. The debris in front of her says otherwise. Signal integrity drops below half. The cracked housing of a perimeter sensor lies 10 yards off the lane, angled in a direction no retreating force would leave it. Heat shimmers over broken fencing, and every stuttering feed on her tablet repeats the same error code. Liability for this corridor sits on her because she holds outer lane authority, and she reports directly to the detachment operations lead stationed at the forward strip. Visibility falls to 80 yards. A medevac aircraft circles overhead, its rotor thrum pressing dust into unstable swirls along the fencing. Radio hiss overlays every transmission, masking the senior controller's insistence that the threat has pulled back. She logs the contradictions, noting the directionality of each scorched fragment. Smoke drifts low, folding into debris fields that still radiate residual heat. Command channel degrades again. Outer perimeter compromised. Minutes remain. A fresh distortion rolls through her sensor slate as the failing daylight drops another shade. She steadies her stance, watching the lane shift beneath wind-pushed grit, and recognizes that the reported vector still doesn't match the ground truth in front of her. Threat assessment shifts, without confirmation. She steps one pace forward, eyes narrowing on movement inside the haze, and the moment suspends 1 second before the breach shows its next decision. Dusk settles across the improvised strip at 0750 hours, dust sliding through headlamp beams as the perimeter security officer steadies her waterproof log slate. Her radio display flickers under particulate, struggling to hold a clean channel, while faint rotor wash pushes grit across the outer lane. She's responsible for under-U.S. authority. Signal degradation increases across the landing zone. She notes the instability, marking time and position, while a short, encrypted radio chirp cuts through static. Dust coats her gloves, her slate, and every surface along the corridor. The operational picture holds for a moment, and this is where we pause. Log your location. Stand by. To follow the mission as it unfolds, the listener must subscribe and state where they are watching from right now. Dusk settles over the improvised Air Force strip at 0755 hours. The last light thinning across scrubland cut flat to make a landing surface barely wide enough for rotary traffic. Wind drags dust in low streamers across the ground, carrying it through the gaps of half-buried perimeter barriers. The outer lane lies unstable, its fencing warped by a previous blast, its sensors faltering under particulate. The perimeter security lead, an Air Force captain, stands responsible for this stretch, holding authority over the lane and reporting directly to the detachment operations officer positioned inside the forward shelter at the strip's center. Visibility drops under 100 yards. She moves deliberately, boots grinding through grit that shifts with every gust. The smoke drifting from the collapsed checkpoint 100 yards forward rolls low, feathering across what remains of the fencing. Headlamps from the blackout refuel line throw narrow cones of white through the haze behind her, illuminating medics and maintainers staging equipment under muted generator hum. No overhead lighting is authorized. The strip functions on discipline alone, every movement dependent on handheld lights, thermal sweeps, and sensor feeds that are growing less reliable by the minute. Sensor gaps widen beyond the checkpoint. Her helmet cam records each sweep of the outer lane. The feed shivers with vibration, picking up dust streaking past her visor. She pauses at a barrier leaning inward at a shallow angle, its base half buried in sand. Blast scarring covers the surface, not enough to collapse the barrier moteur, but enough to disrupt motion sensors anchored beneath it. She crouches, gloves brushing dust from a junction box that should be transmitting a steady heartbeat. Instead, the signal pulses in irregular bursts. She marks the condition on her slate with time and position, aware that under U.S. procedure every discrepancy must be captured, logged, and elevated. Command channel experiences intermittent dropouts. Behind her, the blackout refuel line continues preparing for potential extraction. The turbines of a rotary aircraft idle at low power, pushing warm air in heavy pulses across the ground. Dust lifts, falls, and lifts again in restless spirals. She monitors the effect on visibility. Every 10 yards forward, the haze thickens, obscuring the compromised fencing and the crater scar still visible under fading light. A perimeter security team, 2 ranks below her, waits at the secondary barrier. They hold position, disciplined, observing protocol, awaiting her direction. No one speaks out of turn. No one challenges chain of command flow. Signal noise increases on the outer sensors. The captain edges closer to the fencing, the dull clank of her gear audible under wind. The terrain here slopes downward slightly, just enough to funnel dust into this lane and trap smoke from the earlier impact. She uses her wrist receiver to capture a short sensor burst, temperature fluctuations inconsistent with the claimed containment. She compares them to previous readings. The difference is small, but meaningful. Under American operating standards, even small discrepancies can warn of a hidden shift in threat vector. She logs it. She knows this is the sort of drift command tends to overlook when pressure rises. Perimeter response time increases by several seconds. She brings up her radio display again. The screen flickers, soot-colored dust smearing across its surface as she adjusts bandwidth. The operations officer she reports to speaks in tight, measured bursts, pressure in every word, but discipline intact. The officer reminds her that, for now, the lane is a low-movement environment. She acknowledges calm and procedural, though the evidence at her boots contradicts that position. Under protocol, she cannot escalate until she has documented enough irregularities to justify a reassessment. She continues scanning. Thermal coverage shows cold gaps where it should read hot. A medic jogs past the refuel line, gear slung low, headlamp bouncing against the dark. The captain notes how the beam breaks repeatedly against airborne dust. The lane itself narrows due to debris from the blast crater, which lies roughly 60 yards forward. The crater's lip distorts airflow, pulling smoke sideways in unpredictable eddies. The effect obscures the far edge of the checkpoint, making confirmation of structural stability impossible without physical approach. Her responsibility is to hold position until conditions justify movement, and until command authorizes it. Wind speed rises along the outer barrier. She pauses at a second barrier segment, this one bent outward rather than inward. The asymmetry matters. Blast direction determines threat direction. She documents both angles carefully, aware that misreported blast orientation has caused past perimeter assessments to fail. Her slate captures the time at 0802 hours. The sun is nearly gone now. Only a burnt orange rim hangs at the horizon. The strip will be operating entirely in low light within minutes. She glances back toward the refuel line. The headlamps flicker as dust drags across their beams, creating a rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat under strain. Command channel stabilizes, then drops again. She inspects a sensor node, half hidden by blown sand. Its wiring is exposed along one edge, likely jarred loose by the earlier shockwave. She brushes sand away with the back of a glove and captures another reading. The signal stutters. She logs it. The outer lane is supposed to function as a controlled buffer, a predictable environment for early threat detection. But tonight it behaves like shifting terrain. Never the same twice. Never steady long enough to confirm containment. Thermal drift expands across the collapsed fencing. She shifts position, bringing her helmet cam toward the checkpoint. The silhouettes beyond the crater blur into smoke, their shapes unsteady in dusk. Somewhere beyond that haze lies the downed crew, waiting for extraction. She cannot see them yet, but she can picture where they should be, roughly 120 yards past the breach, tucked behind debris they used as makeshift cover. Every minute she waits, their exposure increases. Every sensor failure she logs moves responsibility further onto her record. Visibility drops below 90 yards. Forward strip. Dusk. Outer lane unstable. She draws a slow, deliberate breath. The muted generator hum blends with the wind, the two sounds forming a backdrop against which every anomaly stands out sharper than before. Dust flecks dance through her headlamp beam, thick enough that she tastes grit at the edge of her teeth. Her radio finally captures a coherent packet from command, though the tone on the other end suggests they still consider the breach minimal. Radio clarity degrades again. She studies the crater one more time, tracing its edges, comparing depth and angle to the scarring on the barriers. The inconsistencies compound. They do not align with the containment narrative being pushed from the operations shelter. Under code, she cannot challenge the assessment yet, but she can prepare for the moment. Everything shifts, and that moment begins with the first fracture, a sensor reading that no longer matches the story being told upstream. Under fading light at 0810 hours, the improvised strip settles into an unstable dusk. Dust moves low across the surface, carried by shifting wind that pushes grit through gaps in the compromised fencing. The female Air Force captain holding the outer lane receives a clear order from the detachment operations officer. Freeze the line. No advance, no repositioning, no push toward the crater. She acknowledges, her voice steady, even as the evidence at her boots begins to pull the situation in a different direction. Visibility drops under 100 yards. She scans the lane again. Smoke rides the wind in thin sheets, drifting sideways across collapsed fencing and coating the air with a bitter haze. The rotary aircraft staged for medevac idles at low power behind her, rotor wash scattering grit in uneven bursts across the strip. Medics stand ready near the aircraft's open ramp, hands on their kits, eyes fixed on the direction of the downed crew still stranded beyond the breach. They do not step forward without authorization. They do not question the order to hold. They stand in disciplined silence, waiting on the perimeter lead to confirm the next movement. Radio distortion increases on the command channel. The captain advances to the edge of the debris field without crossing the freeze line. She observes the crater again, depth and angle illuminated only by the weak reflection of her headlamp and the last fragments of dusk. Something new stands out. A sensor housing, scorched along one face, sitting roughly 40 yards past the crater, rather than inside it, or just outside its lip. It is the wrong place. It is the wrong angle. Under U.S. perimeter procedures, a sensor assembly displaced that far indicates force from a direction different than the one command reported. Thermal readings show inconsistent temperature signatures. She kneels, brushing sand from the sensor housing with the back of a gloved hand. The bracket beneath it is bent outward, not inward. Blast direction matters. It determines whether a threat is retreating, advancing, or repositioning. She captures the orientation with her helmet cam, then records position and time on her waterproof slate. 0812 hours. Evidence contradicts the narrative flowing from the operations shelter. She sends a request for reevaluation, forwarding imagery and position markers. Protocol requires she provide the discrepancies before making any recommendation. Command acknowledgement is delayed beyond normal response time. She stands and sweeps the lane again. Dust streaks through her headlamp beam, thick enough that the edges of the crater blur as she watches. Smoke moves in ragged lines across the fencing, interacting with wind patterns that shift every few seconds. The crater's lip channels the airflow, pulling grit sideways and lifting debris fragments into suspension. None of this matches a stabilized scene. If the threat were truly contained in the direction command asserts, airflow patterns near the blast zone would be cleaner and more Predictable. Signal integrity on outer lane sensors degrades by 20%. She radios the detachment operations officer again, this time noting that 2 additional sensors have dropped from the network. The officer's reply is clipped but steady. The freeze order stands. Internal assessment suggests no additional movement. She accepts the direction without argument, logging each detail for record. Under U.S. procedure, she does not contest orders in the moment. She documents inconsistencies and ensures responsibility for the decision is traceable. Downed crew vitals fall toward threshold levels. A medic at the rotary aircraft checks a handheld receiver linked to the crew's emergency transponders. The data is limited. Smoke and terrain interfere with telemetry, but the indicators trend downward. The medics exchange a look. One steps forward but halts as the captain raises a hand. She cannot authorize movement yet. Freeze means freeze. Her responsibility is to hold the lane until command reevaluates or conditions mandate a procedural override. Visibility drops below 90 yards. She circles the debris field, careful to remain inside the boundary assigned to her. The sand shifts under her boots, the unstable terrain causing each step to slide a few inches before settling. Her radio flickers again, distortion riding the signal like static-filled breath. She taps the housing lightly, clearing dust from the mic. The operations officer requests updated imagery. She sends it. Again. She notes blast orientation irregularities. Again. She identifies sensor displacement inconsistent with the official direction of threat retreat. Command channel experiences intermittent silence. Behind her, the medevac aircraft continues to idle, turbines producing a rising tension drone that merges with the low hum of power units stationed at the strip. Rotor wash rolls grit across the ground in uneven waves. Dust collects on her equipment. Radio display, slate surface, glove seams. She wipes it away with controlled movements, each action precise. Under procedure, clarity of equipment is essential. She ensures every reading is visible, every timestamp legible. Sensor gaps expand across the collapsed fencing. She studies the fencing again. Smoke pools in odd recesses along its base. The thermal feed she receives shows cold gaps where hot readings should appear. Signs of interference or obstruction. She compares these gaps to earlier scans. They have widened. She documents the change. The data conflict grows harder to reconcile with the claim of containment. She radios command again with updated findings, preserving chain of command discipline even as the silence stretches too long. Medical urgency increases as reported pulse strength declines. The medics shift position, adjusting gear, monitoring their receiver for updates. The downed crew's signals flicker in and out, obscured by the debris and smoke. The captain notes the trajectory. She logs it. Each minute that passes reduces the recovery window. If the threat is mislocated, every delay compounds risk. But she follows procedure. She waits on the response that determines whether she will advance. Visibility falls under 80 yards. She kneels by the crater again, tracing the debris, scatter with her gloved hand. Particles drift sideways in a pattern inconsistent with the angle of the main blast shard embedded in the dirt. She notes the contrast. If the explosion originated from the direction command asserts, the debris should fan differently. Her training in perimeter forensics makes the discrepancy unmistakable. She records the details. She sends another packet upstream. Command acknowledgement remains incomplete. The wind surges, carrying a heavier wave of dust across the lane. For a moment, the fencing disappears entirely behind the haze. She switches her headlamp to a narrower beam to cut through the particulate. The crater reappears, edges rigid against the unstable light. Another sensor node blinks erratically upon re-entering view. She sweeps the beam across it and sees the wiring exposed, insulation scraped by sand movement. Thermal coverage shows additional drift along the outer lane. She marks that as well. Procedure requires full documentation. Every detail she captures strengthens the record, should the situation deteriorate. She glances back at the rotary aircraft. The medics stand motionless, but ready, their posture revealing the tension of waiting on a decision that is not theirs to make. The captain knows the responsibility runs through her first. She is the perimeter lead, liable for every second the freeze order holds. Radio distortion spikes across all channels. She exhales slowly, maintaining a steady operational cadence. At 8:20 hours, dusk transitions into near full darkness. Headlamps and limited thermal feeds become the only reliable sources of illumination. Dust continues to move across the lane in unpredictable flows, thinning in one moment, thickening in the next. The fencing silhouette flickers in and out of clarity. The crater remains a fixed, cold shape ahead of her, a reminder that the breach has not stabilized. Breach unresolved. Data conflict detected. She speaks the words evenly, documenting aloud what her slate already holds. The conflicting indicators stack into a pattern: displaced sensors, misaligned blast marks, widening thermal gaps, and worsening vital signs for the crew stranded beyond the lane. She knows that under protocol these factors demand reassessment. She also knows she cannot break the freeze order without explicit authorization or imminent threat proof. Sensor irregularities undermine containment posture. She sends one more update to command. The response is partial. Fragmented phrases carried through distortion. She extracts meaning where she can. No change to posture. Hold position. She acknowledges. She keeps her tone level. She remains procedural. But the evidence continues to shift beneath her boots, like sand that never settles long enough to take a stable reading. Visibility falls under 70 yards. The medics step closer to the aircraft ramp, tension visible in their stance. Dust flickers across their headlamps. The captain turns again toward the crater, assessing each detail with controlled precision. The smoke rising from beyond the breach drifts in a pattern inconsistent with command's reported threat orientation. She marks the new pattern in her mind, knowing she will need to document it formally. Command channel stability drops again. This is the moment she understands that the situation is approaching a threshold. The freeze order holds, but the conditions that justified it are changing. If the data continues to diverge from command's assessment, containment becomes a theoretical position rather than an operational reality. She stands in the center of that gap, the liability falling squarely on her record as the perimeter lead. The last stable second arrives as she recognizes that the next discrepancy she logs will make the current posture untenable. At 8:22 hours, dust shifts again across the improvised strip as the corrected blast data begins moving up the chain. The female Air Force captain stands by the outer lane, helmet cam recording every detail of the breach while her prior discrepancy logs transmit in sequence. The operations officer in the shelter receives the full packet, reviews the debris orientation diagrams she drafted, and elevates the reassessment request to the detachment commander. The record shows that her findings now hold operational weight. Visibility drops under 100 yards. Smoke drifts between collapsed sections of fencing, pulled by crosswinds that roll debris in short, unstable movements. She updates her slate with the exact position of each displaced sensor bracket, noting how the alignment finally matches the retreat vector she flagged earlier. A rotary aircraft circles overhead, rotor wash hitting the strip at irregular intervals and pushing grit through shallow vortices that spin near her boots. She faces the debris field with a steady posture, waiting for authority to shift. Rotor wash intensity increases along the outer lane. The detachment commander reviews her compiled footage, blast angles, sensor placement, thermal gaps, and identifies the inconsistency she has been raising for the last 12 minutes. The containment assumption is revoked. A controlled advance is authorized. The directive moves through the operations officer, who calls her by rank and confirms the new tasking. A two-person push to reopen the corridor. She's assigned point Tratashi. A staff sergeant from the internal lane is assigned rear security. Their objective is to move within 50 yards of the downed crew's position and re-establish a safe passage for medevac extraction. Command channel stabilizes for 5 seconds. She acknowledges the directive, logs the order, and signals the staff sergeant to form on her position. He approaches with deliberate steps, maintaining proper interval and confirming readiness. She verifies his gear state, weapon slung tight, eye protection clear, comms stable. The generator hum behind them merges with the aircraft's low orbit, producing a layered soundscape that underscores the urgency without altering their procedural tone. She steps forward as dust brushes across her visor. Thermal feed shows a narrowing cold gap near the crater. They move toward the debris field with controlled pacing. The crater, once a static marker, now serves as a waypoint guiding their approach toward the trapped aircrew roughly 100 yards beyond. Smoke hangs low in segments, broken by the wind and scattered light from headlamps posted along the strip. The captain studies each plume for directional flow, confirming that the corrected threat vector aligns with the pattern she documented. Her earlier assessment is validated by movement on the ground. Radio distortion drops but does not clear. At 40 yards, shifting debris forces a brief halt. The staff sergeant covers the rear, eyes scanning the perimeter's darker edges where dust and weak illumination merge. She kneels and checks a fractured sensor housing half buried near her position. The scoring pattern on its surface matches the revised blast trajectory exactly. She records it with a steady voice. No commentary, only the essential details for the log. The chain of command now has corroboration from 2 distinct points along the lane. Signal strength decreases by 15% at the corridor midpoint. As they continue forward, rotor wash from the circling medevac aircraft sends another wave of grit skimming across the debris field. Equipment on her vest rattles under the wind, and she steadies her stance before proceeding the next few yards. The corridor ahead narrows between shattered barriers. Smoke threads through the gap, illuminated by her headlamp in uneven pulses. She confirms the route with a brief hand signal to the staff sergeant, who acknowledges and shifts position. Countdown markers begin for medevac landing window. They advance in small increments, each movement documented by her helmet cam and reinforced through verbal updates. She identifies a stable section of ground near a displaced segment of fencing and marks it as a reference point. The staff sergeant scans the right flank, maintaining security and keeping the extraction path clear. Together, they shape the corridor that medics will use once the aircraft descends for recovery. Every step remains controlled, deliberate, and grounded in procedure. Visibility drops under 90 yards. At 60 yards from the downed crew, she stops to reassess airflow patterns. Dust circulates irregularly across the breach, but no outward force indicates a present threat approaching them. Her earlier evidence suggested that the hostile vector had shifted behind the downed crew, not toward the strip. The absence of forward-moving debris supports that conclusion. She logs the airflow conditions, using exact location markers to preserve the record for later review. Rotor wash displaces loose wire near the collapsed barrier. She signals the staff sergeant to hold position while she studies the ground directly ahead. A shallow depression marks where secondary fragmentation fell during the initial blast. She compares it with her earlier footage and notes alignment consistency. Command's updated assessment now matches the physical evidence. The corridor is unstable but usable. She transmits a concise status update. Corridor viable at controlled pace. Conditions acceptable for approach. Thermal fluctuations increase along the debris edge. They resume movement, closing to within 50 yards of the trapped crew. The medevac aircraft begins a slow descent pattern overhead, rotor noise building in depth and pressure. The staff sergeant maintains rear security, confirming no movement along the outer fence line. Wind pushes another sheet of smoke between them and the crew. She waits for it to clear enough to verify terrain before proceeding the next few steps. Even under pressure, she maintains disciplined pacing, Command channel experiences brief packet loss. At 40 yards, she identifies the corridor's critical bottleneck, a narrow passage between two slabs of collapsed concrete. Dust shifts across the surface in quick, unpredictable motions. She tests the footing carefully, applying weight gradually to ensure stability. The ground holds. She marks the passage as the primary entry point for medics once the aircraft lands. Her voice remains even. Her record remains precise. Visibility drops under 80 yards. She and the staff sergeant move through the bottleneck, emerging into a clearer line toward the crew. She checks the vitals receiver linked to their transponders. Still weak, still intermittent pani, but present. The medevac crew counts down the landing window, their voices clipped but steady over the net. Rotor wash intensifies as the aircraft maneuvers into position, sending waves of grit across the debris field. Signal integrity stabilizes at reduced level. She halts at the designated marker, confirming that the corridor is now sufficiently established for medics to advance once cleared. The staff sergeant covers the rear, ensuring no unknown movement approaches from the breach. She delivers the formal notification. Corridor recovery authorized. The chain of command responds, acknowledging her documentation, her assessment, and her execution of the controlled advance. Authority granted. Corridor recovery. She speaks the statement calmly, reinforcing that the task is a direct result of evidence correction and procedural review. The immediate threat is contained enough for recovery operations to begin. Responsibility for the updated posture now resides formally with the command authority that accepted her documented findings. She closes the section with a concise operational acknowledgement that her record has reshaped the mission's course and shifted accountability accordingly. The perimeter settles into a steady rhythm at 0910 hours as dusk light drains across the forward strip. Dust that moved in sheets earlier now drifts in shallow layers over equipment. The generator hum levels into a consistent tone, and the medevac engines idle low, while the rescued crew is transferred to medical personnel standing a few yards from the stabilized corridor. Nothing in her posture suggests triumph. She works the problem to its conclusion. System synchronization improves across the outer lane. The Air Force captain reviews her final entries, marking each detail on her waterproof slate with the same disciplined cadence she used when conditions were unstable. She records distances, times, and observed discrepancies exactly. The operations center receives the log packet seconds later, where a senior officer acknowledges receipt and files the update into the mission record. Every step of her process remains traceable and compliant with U.S. procedure. Visibility improves to over 100 yards. Medics continue their work under perimeter lights that blink back online one row at a time. The captain stands near the lane she secured, confirming that the chain of command review now includes the evidence she documented from the first failing sensor to the corrected blast alignment. Her role is not to celebrate correction, but to maintain the integrity of the record. The soft radio tone confirming receipt of her final sitrep carries across the strip. Duty documented. The corridor remains under control. The survivors move towards safety, and her documentation reinforces the standard that holds operations together when conditions shift. She closes the record with calm certainty, demonstrating that duty, continuity, and accountability remain the foundation of every decision made tonight. Dust settles around the medevac ramp as the rescued crew is lifted aboard. The rotor wash fades into a low murmur, and perimeter lights flicker while sensors complete their reboot cycle. The Air Force captain stands a few yards from the corridor, helmet in hand, watching the system reset. Her decisions tonight rested on a single conflict: an order to hold versus verified evidence that the downed team would not survive without immediate action. Perimeter diagnostics show partial restoration. Senior ranks issued a freeze directive based on incomplete assessment. Ground truth showed a live threat maneuvering behind the stranded personnel. Both paths carried risk. Obey the order and risk losing the isolated crew. Or document the discrepancy in advance, accepting personal liability for acting against standing direction. The tension between command discipline and evidence-based action remains central to every operation conducted under U.S. authority. Which choice protects them? A brief silence passes across the strip before the soft rotor fade fully recedes. Now you decide. Do you hold position under orders, or do you document the truth and move to save the team? State your choice in the comments. Runway lights flicker against the night air, casting long, steady lines across the improvised strip as medics unload gear under hard shadows. A cargo aircraft settles onto the far end of the field at 0100 hours, its engines rolling down while ground crews stage equipment for the next sortie. The helmet cam lens on her rig reflects the glow of the lights as the mission record transfers into the chain as documented fact, secured by the appropriate U.S. personnel. System check completes. A map overlay dissolves into a blurred classified style view, the contours of the last operation already giving way to the shape of the next. A hard radio click cuts through the ambient night, followed by a controlled mission teaser fade from the taxiing aircraft. Next mission queued. If you want continued access to these operational briefings, like and subscribe, and know that the next mission is already waiting.